Welcome to Everything is Changing. In each episode, we focus on circular economy, ecosystem restoration, energy transformation, sustainable mobility, and water resources. I am Ahmetcan Uzlaşık. Perspective is everything, and everything is changing. Today we are back with the first episode of the new season. My guest joining us from Brussels is Ebru Akgün, author of A Dream for Sustainable Agriculture, the Social Ecology of Rose Cultivation. Welcome, Ebru. How are you?
Hello, I'm great. And how are you?
Well, as our audience could understand, I'm a bit sick and my voice is not the best. So sorry for that in advance. But I'm happy to hear that you're well. First, I would love to introduce the author to our listeners. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm Ebru. I am originally from Turkey and based in Brussels, Belgium for a while. I have a background in political science, anthropology, and sustainable development. And I've been working in the field of sustainability, more of its philosophical, anthropological aspects in different levels of academia and lobbying. I am a doctoral researcher in Belgium in this field, and as well as I've been lobbying for sustainability to the European institutions in different contexts. And I'm getting prepared for my new role in the European Commission DG Environment starting very soon.
That is amazing. So normally I hate cliché questions, but I want to start with a classic one because that's the first time I'm interviewing someone about her book. So what motivated you to carry out this research?
It actually all started in 2019. I had just back in the day graduated from my bachelor's in political science in Turkey. And honestly, I was at that point in life where I was searching for a direction. I went on a short trip to Paris with friends and I visited the Shakespeare and Company bookstore, the famous one right across from the Notre Dame. And that actually have changed something. And I found myself surrounded by books on food anthropology and agriculture and a wow movement works by major scholars. And I ended up taking several of them back home with me. And as I started to reading, I began to see how our eating and farming practices are deeply shaped by biological, social, and political elements, shaping them back further. That multidisciplinary perspective really stayed with me and pushed me to take the big step of moving to Belgium to pursue a master's degree in social anthropology and sustainable development. And in that way, I was able to pursue the multidisciplinary study of food and agriculture further. And in many ways, this book grows directly out of that curiosity journey. Nevertheless, it is rooted in my master's thesis, which I wrote at K11 in the years of 2020 and 2022.
And it happened to be a great book. I just recently finished reading it. So, in your book, you use a couple of important concepts, one of which is social metabolism. Why did you find the concept of social metabolism particularly suitable for this study? And there's also another concept called Capitalocene. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. That was the first time that I heard that word, and I thought that for a second you misspelled capitalism, but that's not the case. And how does social metabolism connect to the idea of the Capitalocene?
Well, I would like to start by first talking about the name of the book. And as you said, it is the dream of sustainable agriculture. And yes, I do dream about sustainable agricultural practices. But more than that, what I actually dream about is finding new ways of relating to nature that can basically result in sustainable realities. Linked to that, as humans, we've inherited this long philosophical and practical tradition where we see ourselves as somehow superior to nature, dominant to nature. And unfortunately, that mindset has allowed us to justify exploiting natural environments and even our societies. What's dangerous is that we don't actually choose this way of thinking. It is rather something we learn very early on. It is taught through families and schools and everyday life. So this is how we accept this superiority and right to exploit nature as a normal without even really questioning it. And this normalized hierarchy has supported a number of political and social processes that have intensified sustainability problematics, such examples given as industrialization, wars and conflicts and neoliberal economic systems, and of course, actions causing climate crisis, I would say. However, in a sense, we as humans, we are not separate from nature. We are direct and biological and embedded members of nature. We are connected to nature in the way that we cannot really break it. We are members of the nature as equal as a bird or of a bug or butterfly or a plant. So therefore, instead of maintaining this hierarchical relationship, I suggest in my book perceiving about human nature relations in an interactionist way and applying further actions embracing that point of view. Here I pointed out the concept of social metabolism, which was first proposed by Karl Marx and later developed by other contemporary scholars as a way to explain this interactionist way of human and nature connections. So the idea is that there is a continuous metabolic relationship between humans and nature. Namely, the resources come from nature into the society, they are transformed through processes and they are consumed and eventually they are turned as waste, which completely resembles our human digestive systems in the way that we eat food and our internal organs digest the food and we put out as a waste. So it's basically shows this metabolistic relationship between humans and natures. Within this process, both material and non-material operative elements matter, which is the recent contemporary scholars have developed further top on the earlier discussions on social metabolism. And it describes the operative elements as hardwares and softwares. Hardwares refer to the physical infrastructure that make these transactions possible, let's say, like machines, factories, and technologies that evaluate and devaluate the input coming from the nature. And whereas softwares, on the other hand, includes values, motivations, and institutional arrangements that shape how those processes operate. For example, in the rose cultivation, the distillation facility that produces rose oil would be the hardware, while the cultural and economic motivations behind farming practices would be the software. Furthermore, in my work, I focus particularly on how capital relations shaped as metabolistic processes as a software. And this is where the concept of Capitalocene becomes useful, as you have pointed out in the question. Well, in that sense, you've probably heard the term Anthropocene, right? Which suggests that humans in general have become a force shaping the planet. And when we talk about the Capitalocene, we are basically challenging the idea that environmental and social destruction are caused by humanity as a whole, because historically not all societies have contributed equally to this destruction. Therefore, the concept of the Capitalocene argues that the main driver of societal and environmental crisis is the specific relationships built through the capitalist transaction systems. At a broader sense, those relationships we can refer to values and belief and meaning systems we create based on our habituation with the economic capitalist transaction. So it is not the monetary exchange, it is not the productive exchange, it is not the transactive activities that we involve in, but it is rather the glasses we wear when we're looking at the world, giving the perception that individuals function primarily as participants in a capital network. It can be as producers and consumers, investors. So humans become something rather than natural beings embedded in natural systems in harmony. Therefore, in this network, the nature is treated primarily as a resource to be extracted, transformed, and is turned into profit. And land, water, soil, plants, and even human labor become inputs into production and consumption processes, which indeed relates back to the glasses we wear looking at the world, the glasses enabling us to build value systems, meaning systems coming from those capitalist transactions. Particularly in my research, I investigated how the changing Capitalocene during a course of time in rose farming in Ağlasun have resulted in certain sustainability challenges. which is a negative showcase about the relationship we built with nature. And in that sense, I have provided certain policy and I will say anthropological solutions as well in order to cope with this sustainability problematic as an imagination crisis.
So it was capitalism. I was pronouncing that wrong. Well, let's go with real life cases. In your book, you focus on a town called Ağlasun, which is part of Burdur province, a small city in Turkey, in southwestern Turkey, and Ağlasun has a population of fewer than perhaps 4,000 people. Why did you choose rose cultivation and the Ağlasun region as your focus point? And what role does rose farming play in the cultural and economic life of Ağlasun?
Well, I, to be honest, have before lived in different places in Turkey, but I had never heard about Ağlasun, unfortunately, before I moved to Belgium. And so then my interest,
Me neither, yeah.
my interest in the topic and therefore in the region was directed through my university's research projects in the region, where the Sagalassos ancient archaeological site is located, in which KU Leuven has been excavating the site since 1990s. Therefore, they had been also doing some research with the modern Turkey town in Ağlasun, not in terms of archaeology for sure, but more in terms of sociology and social geography, I would say. And it was a big source of inspiration that projects were designed to encourage researchers, junior researchers, to look at socio-environmental contexts in the region in a more holistic way. So it was basically by chance. I was just only interested in the topic of agriculture and agriculture in Turkey per se. But then I have encountered Belgian researchers, Belgian professors who have been conducting researches in the region, both in the archaeology side, but also in the social geography side, with the ancient site and the modern Turkey town Ağlasun as well. So it was during that time I met with my supervisor back in the day, Martin, and he pointed out me towards the region and rose cultivation per se as an important case study to explore. The relevance and importance, I think it comes from the rose farming in the Lakes region has been part of the landscape since the 19th century Ottoman period. And it has always been a local and large-scale indigenous farming activity, the land, knowledge, culture being transmitted from one generation to another. But what is really striking to the Belgian researchers is how much this practice has changed and has still been changing over time. So basically, that's why I was pointed out in that direction. Indeed, what I can say, not only from the preliminary insights, but also from my solid research outcome, say that rose cultivation has gone through a major social and environmental transformation. This transformation mainly come from greater national and international events impacting even a small isolated town. So then it's a really good example of how agricultural traditions that once relied heavily on indigenous knowledge and practices have been reshaped by broader forces. And it is, I think, also important to note that this whole scheme that I will share is very actually common in Turkey, not only in Turkey, but also in the Mediterranean countries as well, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in the countries who had long agriculture traditions facing with industrialization processes basically experience more or less the same problematics, I would say. To clarify, well, first of all, the neoliberalization of agriculture in Turkey for sure have led to the expansion of the cultivated land, involvement of foreign and national private capital and production methods in the farming, which potentially led to land grabbing and increased pressure for production, dependence on foreign currency, both farming tools and chemicals. At the same time, urbanization trends have removed younger generations away from the villages. This has resulted in serious labor shortages in farming, loss of traditional lifestyles, and the erosion of indigenous knowledge. And on top of all of these, the climate crisis is, of course, making rose cultivation more vulnerable, with rose diseases and freezing winter conditions affecting rose flowers, basically. And finally, these changes are happening alongside deeper structural economic problems in Turkey, making rural livelihoods increasingly fragile.
Yeah, so many demotivations. And in your book also, you listed many reasons for demotivation, not just for rose farmers, but for people interested in agriculture in general, perhaps. From economic crisis to migration to larger cities, there are so many demotivating reasons. But I don't want to talk about the demotives. I want to ask what motivates rose growers today? I know you conducted many interviews. What did you discover about family traditions and the perspectives of younger generations?
So there's actually another quantitative research conducted in 2016, which is a survey among the villagers in Ağlasun. It's a very big survey consisting on lots of different agricultural and husbandry practices. And within that survey, if I'm not mistaken, almost 80% of the rose farmers had shown willingness to continue farming, which was a really high number compared to the other products, let's say. And this was also one of the reasons why my supervisor back in the day pointed out rose cultivation to study, because he was like, hey, Ebru, look at this, like this is very high. The farmers, they're still motivated to cultivate roses, and maybe we should explore whether if this is still the case, and if yes, why, and if not, again, why. Yeah, so for sure we have no information, no knowledge about qualitative aspects of that survey, but my research basically repeated the same exercise in a qualitative way. It revealed a decrease in this number, approximate of 80% to for 40%, because I've conducted the research with the same individuals who joined the survey in 2016. So it's the same sample group, let's say.
And what do younger people think? Do they want to go to Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir and live a different life rather than staying and helping their families in rose cultivation?
So I have not conducted interviews with the younger population, but what I can say is that the rose farming community, the indigenous community, rather than the big agribusiness rose farming community, they are aging, and few young people left in the village. And even though farmers were back in the day economically, culturally, and emotionally motivated to cultivate roses, which were pointed out in the research outcome, let's say, and even though farming is still deeply rooted in family tradition and emotional attachments, many farmers no longer see a future in it for themselves. So the incumbent indigenous farmers are not willing to continue farming due to reasons like high production costs, labor shortages, crop diseases, and growing sense of frustration have led some question to not only the work itself, but their identity as farmers and villagers. And indeed, those farmers, they explicitly expressed that they don't support their children to involving farming due to the challenges posed, and also on top of that, due to the fact that young generation has already left the village, living in bigger cities like Antalya, Ankara, Izmir, Istanbul, and many, many, many others, and working in urban professions, living in urban lifestyles, I would say.
We already talked about a lot of weaknesses, but in the same context, what opportunities did you observe in Ağlasun, in rose cultivation, therefore, any future prospect?
Opportunities, I would list them in three groups, I would say. Well, let's start from the environmental one. It first of all requires low irrigation, like basically no irrigation, which means that it is highly suitable under drought conditions, which are more and more frequent given the course of climate crisis.
That is very important, yes.
Exactly, and which could be expanded as a local sustainable agriculture context, even in the context of climate crisis. So it sounds great, right? It also contributes a lot to the surrounding biodiversity and land balance, carbon sequestration, and climate mitigation. And economically, it provides seasonal supplementary income to the farmers because many of the incumbent farmers, they have other professions rather than farming, like drivers or in the service sector or as a white collar, blue collar, as a civil servant in different means they have other professions, whereas rose cultivation provides seasonal supplementary income.
But was it different in the past? Was rose cultivation their main source of income in the past?
It was, indeed. It was their main source of income because they were basically the dominant force cultivating rose and distilling rose oil water in the village. So then it means that rose per kilogram, the price of rose was basically higher, their income was higher. They had the whole family working in the field. So it means that they were able to harvest, they were able to collect roses every day without any labor shortages. They have also been supported economically and education-wise from the cooperative and the state. Whereas now it has been changed since the last 20, 30 years. Rose being a supplementary, just some portion of their supplementary income, I would say.
Sorry, by the way, you were grouping the opportunities and you were at the third group, I believe. You said environmental contributions, and then you said the contributions to the local economy.
Yes, and also the rose products, the distilled rose oil and water have a strong export potential. 70% of our Turkish production is being exported, and it covers a very big portion of the European import. Even though Bulgaria does also export rose, Turkish rose is basically preferred than Bulgarian rose because of its high oil and water content. And economically, and I could link it to the social and cultural aspects as well, there are lots of tourism and related activities going on in the village related to rose, generating additional income and regional visibility that eventually strengthens the local economy and cultural heritage.
Yeah, in your book, I even remember that the farmers start cultivating the rose very early in the morning, like something like 5 a.m., 6 a.m., so that it won't be dry, it won't become dry under the sun. And that's a very important nuance for them. So, Ebru, as someone who has lived in Istanbul and Ankara, I often hear middle to upper middle class people around me talking about moving to rural areas for a calmer and perhaps a better life. In your book, you use the term rural gentrification. Could you explain what you mean by this and how it has transformed village life? Because we're always talking about how people from small towns and villages migrate to bigger cities, but there's also a reverse trend right now. People are selling their houses in Istanbul and Ankara and moving to small villages to actually start cultivating an agriculture.
Exactly. That actually also is a part of the changing social and environmental dynamics in the Turkish agriculture, let's say. It indeed not only happens through the neoliberalizing forces, but also happens through leisure activities or new meaning-seeking activities of the urban population in Turkey, let's say. In that sense, rural gentrification is a process through which rural spaces are revalued and reshaped by newcomers who often come from urban middle upper class backgrounds. So when people move physically, they also bring their ideas, habits, spaces to the villages and imposing this blend into the incumbent rural lifestyle. So eventually it refers to a broader socio-spatial transformation in how the rural areas are now being imagined, used, and organized. So, yeah, practically speaking, villages that were once structured around agriculture and kinship networks, traditional lifestyles, long-term subsistence practices increasingly are becoming spaces of neoliberal production and consumption, heritage, leisure, tourism, or lifestyle aspirations, which I think relates to neoliberal transformation, neoliberal policies, basically accumulating those people and networks into the villages for greater agricultural businesses and production, industrial agricultural production. But at the same time, people living in the urban areas, the locals of the urban areas, have been losing a sense of meaning and identity in the incumbent urban spaces because of overly populated area, because of good structure and infrastructure, or just maybe having a ideological fracture they're experiencing in their own individual lives, and they move to villages. And as this happened not only in Ağlasun, but also in other many villages in Turkey, those processes bring investment, money, infrastructure, and people into the village. And in the context of rose farming as well, it happens. But eventually it turns land values increasing and agricultural land to be converted into industrial farms, guest houses, and second homes. And then you start to see urban spaces like cafes or like malls start to appear in villages. And then those villages, as a result, the long-term incumbent residents may find it difficult to sustain their livelihoods, and then furthermore, on top of that, have another ideological and identity fracture. So it becomes a mixture of rural and urban life, I would say. In a sense, rural gentrification is a cultural and symbolic transformation of the villages that redefines the meaning of rural life, but rather turning it into something rural and urban mix, an authentic mix, let's say.
And yeah, they don't bring the same cultural values because those local communities, as you said, have their own values and rituals, practices, and family traditions. Well, I'm not a conservative in this sense, but we should still acknowledge that people coming later have a serious impact on those regions. Finally, let's end on a constructive note. What development recommendations, because you have a chapter in your book just dedicated to that, would you make for sustainable agriculture in Turkey?
I truly believe that those recommendations are still very generic, and they have to be studied and instrumentalized more in depth by especially economists and bioengineers, by agricultural scientists, let's say. But as an anthropologist and as a sociologist, as a social scientist, I really try to do my best, and I was a bit ambitious in that sense. But let's say, although my recommendations are parted in three terms, in environmental, economic, and social, I would say the biggest recommendation, the biggest thing to do over there is to create new meanings and habits on the way how we construct our relationship with nature. Because sustainability it has been under this discourse by the politicians, by the bureaucrats, by academia, and this and that. But it is before economy, before industry crisis, it is an imagination crisis. So in that sense, we really should adopt a holistic sustainability approach that integrates environmental, economic, and social dimensions, that is aimed to build new and interactionist human and nature relations that is suggested as in the social metabolism, that is demonstrated, for instance, as in the social metabolism. Yeah, so in that sense, I think there is a big work for anthropologists over there, basically creating a space for the actors involved in sustainability transitions, making aware of their importance and relevance in this context, and linking sustainability as something accessible, as something doable, as something positive, as something that can still fit in their daily lives and daily business operations. In that sense, there's always this discussion between sustainability world, eco-modernism versus degrowth. I will say I am in between the two. I am open for the both, and we should really follow eco-modernist processes if it's necessary, when it's necessary. And another way, we should follow really like the growth processes when it's necessary. So we can find ways to implement the both. However, like in concrete terms, I would say my environmental recommendations would be implementing decarbonizing processes in agriculture and expanding renewable energy use, and for sure improving the energy efficiency. Yeah, basically implementing regulations and practices that support sustainable methods that plans agricultural activities with long-term environmental sustainability in mind. Yeah, furthermore, as economic recommendations, I'm really in favor of state and cooperative and other NGOs establish economic incentives to support sustainable means of agricultural practices while strengthening the farmer assistance and institutional support. And I additionally in favor of research activities in that sense, because research often leads to development. And unfortunately, there is a big research gap and knowledge gap in this field for us to, instrumentalize and operationalize the sustainability transition. Finally, my social recommendations would be investing in rural social infrastructure and structure, let's say, rather than only focusing on urban areas, involving in policies and directives and incentives to protect family farming traditions and basically cultural continuity that will foster farmers' connection to their land, heritage, community, because these kind of indigenous knowledge is not something that we can find in X countries, neoliberal, rose agricultural plant, industrial plant. This is something really special that has been transferred since the 19th century, and there are lots of agricultural products and knowledge in Turkey which are like this, which are very embedded in historical experiences and indigenous knowledge that are unfortunately in decay. So this intergenerational knowledge transfer is really crucial to keep it in place. But overall, I would say improving the agricultural education and organizational planning systems.
Ebru, that was a very comprehensive answer. You listed so many possible solutions for Turkish agriculture, but we can go on for hours because we have billions of problems. So we could just develop billions of questions. But so far, it was a very comprehensive answer and a very comprehensive interview. Thank you very much for joining Everything is Changing, Ebru Akgün.
Thanks for your invitation. It's a pleasure.